Some moments arrive without warning, dressed in ordinary clothes, pretending to be nothing special. This was one of them. The afternoon stretched lazy and golden across Clearwater Bay, the kind of September day that felt stolen from summer's pocket. 26-year-old Natalie Brennan sat on the weathered dock, her bare feet dangling above water that sparkled like shattered glass. She'd come here to think, to escape the suffocating weight of expectations that followed her everywhere like a shadow she couldn't shake. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her father's assistant. Another reminder that dinner at the estate was mandatory, not optional. Another brick in the wall that seemed to close in tighter every day. She silenced it without reading. Across town, in a warehouse that smelled of salt and diesel fuel, 32-year-old Daniel Corvino reviewed shipping manifests with the focused intensity of a man who knew one mistake could cost lives. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he leaned over the documents, his jaw tight with concentration. The numbers had to match perfectly. Everything in his world depended on precision, on control, on never letting emotion cloud judgment. His Lieutenant Vincent cleared his throat from the doorway. The Sullivan shipment cleared customs. No issues, Daniel nodded without looking up. Good news was rare enough to savor even briefly. The territorial disputes with the Brennan organization had intensified over the past months, turning every transaction into a potential flashpoint. His father had built this empire through brutal efficiency. Daniel was trying to transform it into something that wouldn't devour him whole in the process. Back at the bay, Natalie stood and stretched, her sundress catching the breeze. She should go home, face whatever lecture her father had prepared about duty and legacy and the marriage he'd arranged to some businessman she'd met exactly twice. Instead, she walked toward the water's edge where a small motorboat bobbed against its mooring. The boat belonged to the dockmaster, a kind man who'd taught her to fish when she was 7, and never asked questions about why the daughter of Thomas Brennan spent so many afternoons alone by the water. He wouldn't mind if she borrowed it for an hour. She needed to feel something other than trapped. The engine coughed to life, and she steered toward the open water, where the bay widened and the city skyline became just a distant suggestion of civilization. Out here she could breathe. Out here she was just Natalie, not the carefully controlled image her father insisted she maintain. She didn't notice the other boat until she'd drifted nearly a mile from shore. It cut through the water with mechanical efficiency, heading toward the commercial shipping lanes. She recognized the markings, would have recognized them anywhere. Corvino Imports, her father's enemy for as long as she could remember. The name he spoke with equal parts hatred and grudging respect. Natalie turned her boat away, wanting no part of whatever business they conducted. That's when she saw the child. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, leaning too far over the railing of the Corvino boat. Leaning, reaching for something in the water and then falling. The splash was small, almost insignificant against the vast expanse of gray-blue water. But Natalie heard the scream that followed. A woman's voice, raw with terror. She didn't think. Couldn't think. Her hands moved on instinct, throttling the engine, steering hard toward where the small body had disappeared beneath the surface. The Corvino boat had already begun to turn, but boats that size moved like reluctant elephants compared to her nimble craft. Natalie cut the engine and dove. The water closed over her head, cold despite the warm afternoon. She kicked down, eyes burning from the salt, searching the murky depths for any sign of the child. There, a flash of yellow, a dress billowing like a flower. Natalie's lungs already ached as she swam deeper, grabbed the small body and kicked hard toward the surface. They broke through together, the child coughing weakly, and Natalie gasped for air. The Corvino boat loomed above them now, and hands were reaching down, pulling them both from the water with urgent efficiency. Natalie found herself on the deck, water streaming from her clothes and hair, as a dark-haired woman cradled the little girl and sobbed into her wet curls. Medical personnel appeared from nowhere, checking the child with practiced hands, while Natalie sat on the deck and tried to remember how to breathe normally. That's when she saw him. Daniel Corvino stepped from the cabin, his expression carved from granite, his eyes the color of a winter storm. He moved toward the woman and child first, his hand gentle on the little girl's head, his voice too low for Natalie to hear. Then he turned and his gaze locked onto her. Recognition flickered across his face like lightning. She saw the exact moment he placed her, knew whose daughter sat dripping on his deck. His expression went carefully blank, but not before she'd seen the shock, the calculation, the dangerous interest. You saved my niece. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rough like gravel under silk. Natalie pushed wet hair from her face, suddenly aware that her sundress clung to her body in ways that felt far too revealing. Anyone would have done the same. But you did it. He offered his hand, helped her stand. His grip was warm, strong, and lasted a fraction longer than necessary. Natalie Brennan, you know who I am. Your father and I have an understanding. We stay on opposite sides of the line. His eyes held hers, something unreadable moving in their depths, though I suppose that line just got considerably more complicated. The woman with the child approached, her face still wet with tears. Thank you. Thank you so much. I only turned away for a second and Sophie just wanted to see the dolphins and I don't know how to repay you. She's safe. That's enough. Natalie glanced at the shore, at her own boat drifting nearby. I should go. My men will escort you back. Daniel's tone left no room for argument. The waters aren't safe this far out, especially not for someone traveling alone. There was something in the way he said it, a weight that suggested he meant more than just the physical danger of the bay. Natalie wanted to argue, to assert her independence, but exhaustion pulled at her bones and she found herself nodding instead. One of Daniel's men retrieved her boat while another brought towels and a dry jacket that smelled of expensive cologne. Daniel watched the entire process with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Your father will hear about this, he said quietly as they prepared to part ways, I know. It will complicate things. Things were already complicated. She met his eyes steadily. But I'd do it again. She's just a child. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful control. Not many people in our worlds think that way anymore. Maybe that's the problem. They stood there as the boats rocked gently. The afternoon sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. Two people from opposite sides of an invisible war, connected now by a single act of instinctive humanity. Daniel handed her into her boat himself, his hand steadying her elbow. Be careful, Natalie Brennan. The bay isn't the only dangerous water you're swimming in. She started her engine, looked back at him one last time. He stood on the deck like a dark prince surveying his kingdom, his niece safe in her mother's arms, his eyes tracking Natalie's departure with an expression she couldn't quite name. As she steered toward shore, her phone erupted with messages. Her father had indeed heard. And from the tone of his texts, dinner was going to be even worse than she'd anticipated. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see her father's anger or the arranged marriage or the suffocating expectations. She saw Daniel Corvino's face, the way he'd looked at her like she was a puzzle he desperately wanted to solve, even though solving it might destroy them both. Behind her, on the Corvino boat, Daniel watched until she became just a speck against the shoreline. Vincent approached cautiously. Boss, this is going to create problems. I know. It will complicate things. Things were already complicated. She met his eyes steadily. But I'd do it again. She's just a child. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful control. Not many people in our worlds think that way anymore. Maybe that's the problem. They stood there as the boats rocked gently, the afternoon sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. Two people from opposite sides of an invisible war, connected now by a single act of instinctive humanity. Daniel handed her into her boat himself, his hand steadying her elbow. Be careful, Natalie Brennan. The bay isn't the only dangerous water you're swimming in. She started her engine, looked back at him one last time. He stood on the deck like a dark prince surveying his kingdom, his niece safe in her mother's arms, his eyes tracking Natalie's departure with an expression she couldn't quite name. As she steered toward shore, her phone erupted with messages. Her father had indeed heard, and from the tone of his texts, dinner was going to be even worse than she'd anticipated. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see her father's anger or the arranged marriage or the suffocating expectations. She saw Daniel Corvino's face, the way he'd looked at her like she was a puzzle he desperately wanted to solve, even though solving it might destroy them both. Behind her, on the Corvino boat, Daniel watched until she became just a speck against the shoreline. Vincent approached cautiously. Boss, this is going to create problems. I know. Thomas Brennan's daughter just saved your niece's life. He'll see it as weakness, or worse, as strategy. Let him see it however he wants. Daniel turned away from the railing, his expression hardening back into the mask he wore for business. But his hand, hidden in his pocket, was clenched into a fist. Make sure she gets home safely. Put 2 men on her building. Discreet surveillance. I want to know if anyone approaches her because of this. Boss, that's risky. If Brennan finds out we're watching his daughter, it'll look like an escalation. Then don't let him find out. Daniel's voice dropped to a tone that ended all discussion. She saved Sophie. That creates a debt, and I always pay my debts. What he didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that debt wasn't the only reason he wanted her protected. Something had passed between them in those brief moments. Something electric and dangerous and utterly impossible given who they were. But impossible had never stopped Daniel Corvino before. And he had the unsettling feeling it wouldn't stop him now. The Brennan estate sat like a crown jewel on the north side of the city, all white columns and manicured gardens that whispered old money and older secrets. Natalie's hands shook as she parked her small sedan beside her father's collection of luxury vehicles. The contrast felt symbolic, her modest independence dwarfed by his excessive displays of power. She'd changed into appropriate dinner attire, a navy dress that her father's stylist had selected months ago, but her hair still held the faint smell of salt water, a reminder of the afternoon that had somehow changed everything. Thomas Brennan waited in his study, a crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand, his silver hair impeccably styled despite the late hour. At 61, he remained a formidable presence, his pale blue eyes missing nothing, his posture that of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Sit down, Natalie. She remained standing. Small rebellions were all she had left. His jaw tightened, but he didn't press the issue. You saved Daniel Corvino's niece this afternoon. I saved a child from drowning. I didn't check her family tree first. Don't be flippant. This is serious. He set down his glass with controlled precision. Do you have any idea what position this puts me in? My daughter indebted to my greatest rival. The optics alone are disastrous. A 4-year-old fell in the water. I pulled her out. That's not politics, Dad. That's basic human decency. There is no such thing as basic anything when it comes to the Corvinos. Thomas moved to the window, his back rigid. Daniel Corvino is not some benevolent businessman. He runs an organization built on violence and intimidation. His father, God rest his ruthless soul, killed more men than I can count. And now the son is trying to legitimize their empire while still keeping his hands in every illegal operation from here to Providence. And you're describing yourself as much as him. The words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas turned slowly, and Natalie saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, but something colder. Recognition, perhaps, or disappointment that she'd finally said aloud what they'd both pretended not to know. I have built something that will last generations, he said quietly. Everything I've done has been to secure your future, to give you opportunities I never had. And in return I ask for loyalty, for trust, for you to understand that some lines cannot be crossed, like saving a child's life, like developing any connection whatsoever with Daniel Corvino. His voice hardened. I've already received 3 calls about this. People are talking, speculating about what it means. Some see it as weakness, others as strategy. Either interpretation is dangerous. Natalie's phone buzzed in her purse. She ignored it, but Thomas's eyes tracked the sound. Is that him? Has he contacted you? No, but he will. Thomas returned to his desk, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the polished wood toward her. I need you to understand exactly who you're dealing with. She didn't want to look. But curiosity and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like concern, made her open the folder. Inside were photographs, surveillance images of Daniel Corvino over the past several years. Meeting with known criminals, entering buildings associated with money laundering, standing at funerals of men who died violently. But there were other images, too. Daniel at a children's hospital opening, his hand on the shoulder of a young cancer patient. Daniel at his sister's law school graduation, pride evident even in the grainy photograph. Daniel sitting alone at a cafe reading a book, looking younger and more vulnerable than the man she'd met today. He's complex, Natalie said softly. He's dangerous, and now he'll feel obligated to you. That obligation creates opportunities for manipulation, for drawing you into his world. I won't allow it. You don't control me. I control your trust fund until you're 30. I control the building where your design studio is located. I control significantly more of your life than you'd like to admit. His expression softened slightly, became almost paternal. I'm not trying to be cruel, sweetheart. I'm trying to protect you from a man who will use your kindness against you. Or maybe you're trying to protect yourself from the possibility that I might see you differently if I get to know your enemy. The accuracy of her observation landed like a physical blow. Thomas's mask slipped, revealing something raw underneath. Fear, maybe, or the terrible isolation of a man who'd sacrificed too much for power and couldn't afford to lose the only person who mattered. The wedding is in 6 weeks, he said finally. Richard Castellane is a good man. His family's shipping business complements ours perfectly. You'll want for nothing, except love, except choice, except my own life. Love is a luxury we can't afford in this business. Choice is an illusion for people without real stakes. And your life has been intertwined with mine since the moment you were born. He closed the folder. I'm asking you, Natalie, don't pursue this. Whatever curiosity you feel about Daniel Corvino, let it go. For your safety and for mine. She should have agreed, should have nodded and played the dutiful daughter and accepted the cage he'd gilded so carefully. Instead, she picked up the folder, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the door. Natalie. She paused but didn't turn around. He will break your heart. Or worse, he'll use you to break mine. Is your rebellion worth that price? I don't know yet, she answered honestly. But I'm tired of letting you make every decision for me out of fear. She left him standing in his study, surrounded by symbols of his power, looking suddenly older and more alone than she'd ever seen him. Outside, the evening air felt crisp against her flushed cheeks. She sat in her car for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady her breathing. Her phone buzzed again. This time she looked, an unknown number, a simple message that made her heart skip. Thank you for saving Sophie. If you need anything, call me. Daniel. She stared at the words, at the number now saved in her phone, at the door she could walk through or keep forever closed. Her father's warnings echoed in her mind. Daniel's eyes as he'd watched her leave echoed louder. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment that overlooked the harbor, Daniel set down his own phone and poured himself a drink he didn't want. His sister Carmela sat across from him, her expression troubled. You shouldn't have given her your number. She saved Sophie. And now Thomas Brennan's daughter has direct access to you. Do you understand what he could do with that? The ways he could use her to hurt us? Daniel's hand tightened on his glass. Natalie isn't her father. How do you know? You spoke to her for 5 minutes on a boat. I know. He couldn't explain how, couldn't articulate the certainty that had settled in his chest, but when Natalie had looked at him, he'd seen something he recognized. Someone trapped in a life they'd never chosen, trying desperately to find a way to be good in a world that punished goodness. This is dangerous, Danny. Carmela used his childhood nickname, the one only she was allowed. Dad spent his whole life fighting the Brennans. You've spent yours trying to end that war peacefully. Getting involved with Thomas's daughter could destroy everything you've built. Or it could be exactly what finally ends this. He met his sister's eyes. What if there's another way? What if instead of circling each other like enemies, we find common ground? Through her? Maybe. Carmela stood, came around the table, and placed both hands on his shoulders. You're my brother and I love you, so I'm going to tell you the truth. That woman is either bait in a trap or a genuine innocent who'll get caught in the crossfire. Either way, pursuing her ends badly. For both of you. After she left, Daniel stood at his window and watched the city lights reflect off the harbor. His phone sat on the table, silent. Natalie hadn't responded to his message. She was probably smarter than him, had probably already deleted his number and decided to forget this afternoon ever happened. But he found himself hoping she wasn't that smart. Found himself waiting for a response that might never come. Like a fool who'd forgotten that in their world. Hope was the most dangerous commodity of all. In her apartment across town, Natalie stared at Daniel's message for the 100th time. Her finger hovered over the reply button. One word, one sentence, one acknowledgement would crack open a door her father insisted she keep locked. She typed and deleted a dozen responses. Finally, she wrote something simple. Your niece seems wonderful. I'm glad she's okay. She hit send before she could overthink it, then immediately regretted every choice that led to this moment. Her phone buzzed almost instantly. She is. Takes after her mother, thankfully. Are you all right? I imagine your father wasn't pleased. The concern in those words, the acknowledgement that he understood the position he'd put her in, made something warm bloom in her chest. She shouldn't respond, shouldn't encourage this, shouldn't want to know more about a man her father considered his mortal enemy, she responded. Anyway, he wasn't, but I'm used to disappointing him. Something else we have in common. And just like that, the door she'd been holding closed began to open, not wide, just a crack. But sometimes that's all it takes for light to flood into darkness, for possibility to take root in impossible soil. Neither of them slept well that night, both lying awake in their separate corners of the city, thinking about a stranger who felt somehow familiar, about a connection that shouldn't exist but did, about the terrible and wonderful ways that fate sometimes dressed up in ordinary clothes and changed everything with a single moment of unexpected humanity. 3 days passed before they met again. 3 days of messages that started careful and gradually became conversations. Natalie learned that Daniel loved old architecture, spent his mornings reading philosophy, and had taught himself to cook as a teenager when his mother died, and no one else could manage both grief and dinner. Daniel learned that Natalie designed sustainable buildings, volunteered at a literacy program, and collected vintage jazz records that she played when her design work felt uninspired. They didn't talk about their fathers, didn't acknowledge the war brewing around them. Instead, they built a small world made of words where they were just two people discovering they liked talking to each other far more than logic suggested they should. The meeting happened by accident, or perhaps by the universe's sense of irony. Natalie had gone to the Harbor District Gallery, a converted warehouse that showcased local artists. She needed inspiration for a community center project, needed to see how other people transformed spaces from industrial to intimate. She didn't expect to find Daniel standing in front of a massive abstract painting, his expression contemplative. He sensed her presence before she spoke, turned, and something electric passed between them. Recognition, yes, but also relief, as if they'd both been holding their breath for days and could finally exhale. I didn't know you came here, Natalie said, walking closer. Every month. The owner is an old friend. Daniel's eyes traced her face like he was memorizing it. You? First time. I'm working on a project that needs creative thinking. Want company? I'm told I occasionally have creative thoughts. They walked through the gallery together, keeping a careful distance that felt more intimate than touching. Daniel explained the history of the building, how it had been a textile factory in the 1920s before being abandoned and nearly demolished. Natalie pointed out the architectural details, the way original brick was preserved alongside modern steel, creating dialogue between past and present. It's like redemption, she said, standing beneath soaring ceilings, taking something discarded and showing it still has value. Is that what you do? Redeem buildings? I try to see potential where others see problems. She glanced at him. Probably a character flaw. Or a gift. His voice dropped lower. Do you see potential in me, Natalie? Or just problems? The question hung between them, loaded with meanings neither dared fully explore. She should make a joke, deflect, maintain the careful distance they'd established. Instead, she told the truth. Both. Which terrifies me. Good. I'd be worried if you weren't scared. I'm terrified of you. Me? I'm the least frightening person I know. That's exactly why you're dangerous. Daniel moved closer, just half a step, but suddenly the air felt thinner. You make me want things I swore I'd never let myself want. Things that could destroy everything I've built. Like what? Like this, he kissed her. Not forcefully, not presuming consent, but with a question in the gentle pressure of his lips against hers. A question she answered by rising onto her toes, by threading her fingers through his hair, by opening herself to a connection she knew was reckless and wrong, and somehow more right than anything she'd felt in years. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. We can't do this, he whispered. I know. Your father will see it as betrayal, mine as weakness. Our organizations will tear us apart. I know, and I can't stay away from you. His hands framed her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones. I've tried. God knows I've tried. But Natalie, you're in my head, in my chest, in places I thought I'd locked away forever. She understood. In 3 days of messages and one afternoon on a boat, this man had become essential in ways she couldn't explain. Not love, not yet, but something that felt like standing on the edge of an enormous canyon, knowing one more step would send her flying or falling, unable to tell which. "What do we do?" she asked. "We're careful. We meet quietly. We don't flaunt this where our fathers can weaponize it, so we hide. We protect each other. There's a difference." He kissed her again, softer this time, like a promise. "I won't let anyone hurt you because of me. I'm more worried about you getting hurt because of me." He smiled, and she saw the boy he must have been before responsibility and violence carved away his youth. Then we're even. They left separately, keeping their secret safe for another day. But as Natalie drove home, she felt lighter than she had in months. Not because she was rebelling against her father, though that was certainly part of it, but because for the first time since she could remember, she'd made a choice purely for herself. Not out of obligation or fear or duty, but because her heart insisted and her mind finally agreed. The consequences would come. She wasn't naive enough to believe otherwise. But some risks were worth taking. Some connections were worth fighting for, and some people were worth burning down your carefully constructed life to protect. Daniel, sitting in his office hours later, came to the same realization. His phone buzzed with another message from her, something simple about the sunset over the harbor. He responded with a quote from a philosophy book they'd discussed, and her laugh emoji made him smile like an idiot. Vincent walked in, saw his expression, and shook his head. "You're in deep, boss. Shut up. I'm just saying I've known you 15 years. Never seen you like this over anyone. She's different. She's Thomas Brennan's daughter. That's not different, that's catastrophic." Daniel set down his phone, his expression sobering. "Then we make sure the catastrophe is controlled. Increase security around her building. I want to know if anyone from her father's organization approaches her. And start looking into Richard Castellane, the guy she's supposed to marry. Background, business dealings, everything. If Thomas Brennan chose him, there's an angle. I want to know what it is." After Vincent left, Daniel returned to the window to the view of the harbor where this had all started. Somewhere out there, Natalie was looking at the same water, thinking probably similar thoughts. Two people from opposite worlds connected by chance and choice, standing on the edge of something that could destroy them or save them. He'd spent his whole adult life being careful, being strategic, protecting his family by never giving enemies leverage. Natalie was leverage incarnate. A weakness his rivals could exploit, a weapon his enemies could use. But she was also hope. Proof that their worlds didn't have to be defined by their father's hatred. Evidence that people could choose differently, could build bridges instead of walls. The war between their families had lasted 20 years. Daniel was suddenly certain it would end one of two ways. Either he and Natalie would find a way to make peace, to forge something new from the ashes of old conflicts, or their attempt would set everything ablaze, consuming them both in the process. He was willing to risk it. That realization should have terrified him more than it did. Instead, it felt like the first truly honest choice he'd made since inheriting his father's empire. Across the city, Natalie stood at her own window, her phone in her hand, Daniel's last message still glowing on the screen. Behind her, on the table, sat the folder her father had given her. Evidence of Daniel's complicated life, his dangerous connections, all the reasons she should walk away. She picked it up, walked to her kitchen, and dropped it in the recycling bin without opening it again. Whatever Daniel Corvino was or wasn't, she would discover it herself. Not through her father's curated narrative, not through fear and surveillance photos, but through her own experience. It was reckless. It was potentially devastating. It was also the most alive she'd felt in years. She texted him a simple goodnight, added a heart emoji before she could overthink it, and went to bed with hope blooming in her chest like spring after an endless winter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new complications. But tonight she'd made a choice for love instead of fear. And somehow that felt like the bravest thing she'd ever done.